She left her grandparents' house like she always did. She drove home, and she was never seen again. There was no struggle reported, no emergency call, just silence. Her car made it back. Her belongings were still there. She wasn't. Which means whatever happened after she walked through her own front door. Her name was Bethany Decker. Bethany was expected to be in contact, expected to show signs of life. Messages, movements, something ordinary. Nothing about the silence felt urgent at first. When days passed without explanation, concern didn't arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, wrapped in patience and benefit of the doubt. Everyone assumed there was a reason. Everyone assumed she would resurface. Most people imagine disappearances as immediate, impossible to miss. This wasn't that. And that uncertainty would define everything that followed. The place Bethany was last known to be wasn't hidden. It wasn't remote. It was a normal living space, the kind people leave every day without thinking twice. Weeks passed, and the silence stayed consistent. No activity, no trace that explained where she had gone. One person stood closest to her daily life, close enough to notice the absence, close enough to explain it, at least at first. What began as concern slowly shifted into something else. Because the silence didn't behave the way it should. This wouldn't become a case with clear answers. It would become a case defined by what was missing, and what was quietly avoided. Records mattered. Timelines mattered. And what didn't happen after Bethany disappeared would become just as important as what did. To understand what happened to Bethany Decker, you have to look closely at the silence surrounding her disappearance, and the person who lived closest to it. Bethany was 21 years old. She was a young woman in motion, balancing independence with responsibility, adulthood with the safety nets she still kept close. Friends and family described her as warm, outgoing, and deeply relational. She laughed easily. She stayed connected. She was the kind of person who checked in, who responded, who didn't disappear without explanation. That mattered. Because Bethany's life was not chaotic. It was structured. She had routines, relationships, and plans that extended beyond the next day or week. She socialized. She showed up. And when she didn't, people noticed. Bethany had grown up close to her family, maintaining strong bonds even as she stepped into adult independence. She stayed in touch with her grandparents, spent time with friends, and kept her phone close. Silence was not her habit. Distance was not her pattern. At 21, Bethany was doing what so many people her age do, learning how to live on her own while still tethered to the people who knew her best. Her apartment in Ashburn represented that transition. It was a place of responsibility, of autonomy, of trust. She shared her life with others. She was not hidden. She was not unreachable, which is why what followed felt immediately wrong. After returning home that day, Bethany did not answer her phone. There were no outgoing calls, no messages, no social media activity. Her financial accounts went quiet. No purchases, no withdrawals, no trace of movement beyond the walls of the apartment she had just entered. At first, the silence was subtle. Missed call, then another, then hours passed. By the time concern began to settle in, one fact stood out above all others. Bethany and Decker had never done this before, and the last person known to have seen her would later say she was there, inside that apartment, after the door closed. What happened next did not announce itself with noise or chaos. It unfolded in absence, and that absence would only grow heavier with time. Bethany Decker's life did not exist in isolation. It was shaped by relationships, some steady and familiar, others newer, still finding their balance. Among them was her boyfriend at the time, Ronald Roldan. They had been dating for several months. Friends described the relationship as close, but not without tension. Like many young couples, they navigated disagreements, expectations, and the uneven rhythms of early adulthood. What mattered most to investigators was access. Ronald Roldan had it. He knew Bethany's routines. He knew her apartment. He knew when she was expected to be alone. That proximity did not immediately signal wrongdoing, but it placed him at the center of the timeline when Bethany vanished. In cases like this, access is not accusation. It is context, and context shapes questions. Roldan told investigators that he saw Bethany at her apartment later on January 29th, after she returned from her grandparents' home. According to his account, she was there, live, inside the space where her phone, her belongings, and her life would soon go still. That statement anchored the investigation to a specific place and time, and it narrowed the window. Friends and family began retracing the days leading up to Bethany's disappearance. There were no dramatic arguments reported, no announced plans to leave town, no expressed fears. But there were small things, moments that felt ordinary at the time, then heavier in hindsight. Missed plans, subtle changes in tone, the kinds of details that rarely stand out until everything else falls away. Investigators looked closely at the relationship dynamic, careful not to leap ahead of the evidence. They noted that Bethany was independent and communicative. She did not vanish to make a point. She did not withdraw without explanation. If she was upset, she talked about it. If she needed space, she said so. That made the silence harder to reconcile. As days passed, attention returned again and again to the apartment. It was the last confirmed location, the last known point of normalcy. Whatever happened to Bethany likely began, or ended, there. And yet, the space itself offered few answers. No signs of forced entry. No obvious disturbance. No clear indication of a struggle. Just stillness. The lack of visible chaos did not ease concern, deepened it. Because when a person disappears without leaving a trace, investigators begin to ask not just what happened, but how it could happen so quietly. The case did not yet have a suspect, and at its center was a relationship defined by access, timing, and unanswered questions. Questions that would only grow more urgent as Bethany's silence stretched from hours into days, and then into something far more permanent. January 29, 2011, ends without alarm. Bethany Decker returns to her apartment in Ashburn, Virginia, after visiting her grandparents. The drive is routine. The destination is familiar. According to the last account placing her alive, she is inside her apartment later that day. And then the record stops. Her phone goes silent. There are no outgoing calls, no text, no location pings that suggest movement elsewhere. Her bank accounts show no activity. Credit cards remain untouched. The digital footprint of a 21-year-old woman, normally active, responsive, predictable, flatlines. Investigators begin with what they can measure. They confirm the last known sighting. They review phone logs. They check financial records. They canvass the apartment complex. They look for witnesses who might have seen Bethany leave, meet someone, or get into a vehicle. Nothing solid emerges. No confirmed sighting after she is reportedly seen inside her apartment. The apartment itself becomes the focal point. Inside, investigators find Bethany's belongings, clothing, personal items, things she would not have left behind if she planned to go somewhere for long. There are no clear signs of a struggle, no broken furniture, no obvious disturbance that points decisively toward violence. But absence can be evidence too, because what is missing matters. Bethany's car is not reported abandoned somewhere else. There is no trail leading away from Ashburn. No indication she packed up or prepared to disappear. The apartment does not tell a story of departure. It tells a story of interruption. As the days pass, investigators widen the scope. They retrace Bethany's final movements. They speak again with those closest to her. They return to Ronald Roldan's account, because it places him at the last known intersection of Bethany's life and silence. Roldan maintains that he saw her that day. That statement is critical. It anchors the timeline. It establishes a narrow window in which Bethany disappears from the world. Investigators assess the consistency of that account against the evidence that follows, against the total lack of activity that begins almost immediately afterward. Still, proof remains elusive. There is no body, no crime scene definitively identified, no forensic evidence strong enough to declare what happened next. Searches expand beyond the apartment. Surrounding areas are checked. Woods, waterways, and nearby locations are examined. Tips come in. Many of them emotional, some of them vague. None lead to Bethany. The case enters a difficult phase. Without a confirmed crime scene, investigators cannot reconstruct events with certainty. Without physical evidence, they cannot move from suspicion to charge. And without Bethany herself, every theory remains incomplete. What remains undeniable is this: Bethany Decker did not continue her life after January 29, 2011. She did not contact anyone. She did not access money. She did not leave a digital or physical trace suggesting a voluntary disappearance. The silence is total. And silence, in investigations like this, is not neutral. Presses outward, raises questions. It demands answers that the evidence, so far, refuses to provide. By the time weeks turn into months, the case has not resolved into clarity. It has settled into uncertainty. A young woman is missing. A timeline has narrowed. A last known location has been identified. But what happened inside that apartment, and how Bethany Decker vanished without leaving a trace, remains unanswered. For now, there was no arrest, no indictment, no courtroom moment where questions were finally answered under oath. As the months turned into years, the investigation into Bethany and Decker's disappearance remained open, but unresolved. Law enforcement continued to state publicly that the case was active, that it had not been forgotten, that leads were still being evaluated. But without new evidence strong enough to meet the threshold for charges, the case did not move forward through the criminal justice system. The absence of an arrest did not mean the absence of concern. Investigators acknowledged that Bethany's disappearance was not consistent with a voluntary decision to leave her life behind. She had responsibilities, commitments, family connections she maintained closely. She was in regular contact with people who cared about her. Her sudden and complete silence stood in direct contrast to who she was. That contradiction remained at the center of the case. Ronald Roldan, the last person known to have seen Bethany, was questioned extensively in the early stages of the investigation. His statements were documented, his timeline examined, but without corroborating physical evidence tying him or anyone else to a crime, the case could not advance beyond investigation. And so it stalled in the space between suspicion and proof. For Bethany's family, that space became a permanent reality. They lived without answers, without confirmation, without the certainty that comes from knowing what happened to someone they loved. Birthdays passed. Holidays came and went. Each one carried the same unresolved question. Where is Bethany, and why has no trace of her ever surfaced? Public attention faded over time, as it often does in cases without dramatic developments. But for those closest to Bethany, the passage of time did not dull the urgency. sharpened it. Every year without information became another year of living with absence instead of grief's finality. Bethany Ann Decker was 21 years old when she vanished. She was a young mother, daughter, a granddaughter, a woman whose life was actively unfolding. Her story is not defined by a single moment, but by the void that followed it. Cases like Bethany's expose the hardest truth about missing person investigations: that not all disappearances resolve cleanly, that evidence can vanish faster than memory, and that accountability, when delayed too long, can slip permanently out of reach. Yet the case remains open. Her name remains on investigative files. Her face remains in the minds of those who refuse to forget. And her absence continues to matter. Because unresolved does not mean unimportant. And silence does not mean surrender. If you found this case fascinating, don't forget to like the video and subscribe.